As a follow-up to a 19-year-old game, you'd hope for more than just a still image recap for the opening of Metroid Dread. Players new to the series, unfamiliar with the backstory, will probably zone out reading this dry summary, while it would be nice if returning players got to celebrate booting up the first original Metroid in over a decade, with something more than concept art. Get the Prime Hunters cutscene guys or the Other M commercial team in here. Get people hyped up with a Kingdom Hearts recap music video, something. Boot up Super Metroid in '94, and for a console game of the time, you're experiencing high production value, a 2D sprite opening that has visual parity with the game you're about to play, but Metroid Dread's opening doesn't. Games with gameplay on a 2D plane have a stigma for being less valuable than full 3D games, which is unfortunate, but let's not pretend that those same 2D games like Dread don't leverage this stigma a little bit to cut corners. Concept art, flashbacks, and poorly lit cutscenes that make the characters look like action figures rely on you having lower standards for what 2D games can be. And yet, for a 2.5D style game, Metroid Dread is still one of the best looking ones. When the lighting is framed just right, detail and tasteful use of color can come together to make some terrifically moody areas. The forest levels can look a bit messy and cheap sometimes, with an overabundance of clashing colors, while ice levels have the opposite problem, looking too monochrome and bland. And the Emmy Zone's idea of taking a grey empty room and just cranking up the contrast and adding film grain is an unconvincing attempt at creating an oppressive atmosphere. It's again when the camera decides to go anywhere but the curated angle the regular gameplay uses where it looks its worst though. The game's lighting seems tailor-made to make the game look its best when the camera is zoomed out and facing the gameplay head on. When it breaks away from that and starts moving around all over the place and zooming in, that quality doesn't get to follow the camera with it. If this game were a sandwich, most of the game would be fresh, high-quality ingredients, and the camera zoom-ins are the bread surrounding it that's one day off from being stale. Presentation takes a dip from previous titles as well in the music department, which is serviceable. A somewhat scathing assessment considering the pedigree of soundtracks this series has given us. It's got that Overblood 1 ambience. Keep in mind, Dread's presentation doesn't just feel inconsistent compared to some modern games on more powerful hardware. It feels inconsistent compared to games in its own series from decades ago. That's a shame because the gameplay within that canvas is some of the most smooth, tight, exciting, fast-paced single-player shooter action out there right now, and it would have been nice to present this awesome 2D gameplay to the world as best as possible. Samus glides along like butter, switching to what move you want her to do next almost instantly. To compensate, she's in a world with deadly fast enemies that make you make the most of that responsiveness. Selling Samus's swift movements are a huge array of detailed animations that convincingly allow her to snap between moves and stances. There's even some cool little animations for how she interacts with the world around her, putting her hand on the side of walls to steady her aim, for example. Unlike Samus Returns on the 3DS, the parry can now be done while moving, making countering enemies much less of a stop-and-start process, daring you to run through levels without stopping, flicking enemies out of the way with good timing. I think it's fair to say at this point that folding platforming into action combat works a lot better on a 2D plane than on a 3D one. So while Samus doesn't have combos or weapon switching mix-ups, the way you can use the environment around you to your advantage can make for a lot of split-second exciting choices mid-combat. The slide allowing now for quick ducks and dives in and around the area in a much less stilted way than prior titles. Now that a 2D Metroid is on a console with built-in dual analog sticks, would a dual-stick shooter setup be a good idea at this point? Moving with one stick with precise aiming always available on the other one. A rebalanced game tweaked to make the most of such versatility could be even more frantic and exciting. It's something I ponder as I play this game that basically treats an entire second stick as an extra face button and doesn't use it for anything else. I wonder though, if allowing for such precise aiming while on the go would make the game a little easy, even if rebalanced to accommodate for it. If you could just always have your second thumb tracking the enemy, which is a much more easy task when aiming on a 2D plane. Precise aiming requiring standing still creates these tense moments where you have to stand your ground and know when to get back to moving. Can't say I feel strongly one way or another just yet. Gameplay in 2D Metroid isn't just about efficiently making a fool of enemies, but making a fool out of the environment too. 2D Metroid set up these levels where there's usually an intended way to get around, both on a micro and macro level, but a skilled player can maximize the mechanics to get around faster. On the micro level, it can come down to traversing a single shaft faster by timing wall jumps instead of using the intended slower wall climb or grab points. Or on the macro level, infinite ball bombing or aiming a shine spark to cleverly get an item before you're intended to, maybe then making use of that item early to skip an entire area. Dread has examples of micro and macro skips, but it isn't as freeform as some past titles like Super Metroid or Zero Mission. Shine sparks and infinite bomb jumps can help you get cheeky, but 2D Metroid still isn't ballsy enough to bring back wall jumping against the same wall. It's cool to see the game recognize a major sequence break, like getting the bombs early, allowing for a special Kraid insta-kill attack, but I don't think that's a fair trade-off for the movement versatility we lost after Zero Mission. In Super and Zero, that vertical wall jump allowed for all kinds of skips, large but also small. On a moment-to-moment basis, the ability to exploit the game world cheekily was there. I learned about this early bomb skip after beating Dread. I was told about it. But in a game like Super Metroid, the far more versatile wall jumping techniques are more likely to have you experimenting on the fly and discovering tricks and skips yourself. But regardless of the amount of traversal techniques available, you may simply be more inclined to experiment in an older title like Super Metroid because the game doesn't hold your hand as much as Dread does. Some of the major skips in Dread aren't very hard to perform, but the way the game guides you around, with far more points of no return than in Super or Zero, or how convenient teleporters appear right after you get a new major power-up to put you in the right place, while on my first time around, I never got stuck and was therefore not encouraged to try and get one over on the game with a cheeky trick. When I first beat Super Metroid, I did it without the grapple hook, simply by experimenting with wall jumps and shine sparks. And if the game had been easier, I probably wouldn't have resorted to trying. Dread isn't as restrictive as Fusion, and after Other M it feels like a tour de force open world, but I think the game could have let loose a little more, with less points of no return and less hand-holding teleporters. Previous Metroid games would often give you a new power-up and place the next key item on the other side of the world, without teleporters placed nearby to get you back there. The difference in something like Prime is that if you stumbled around without finding that key item for a bit, Samus's suit would send out a scan, giving you a general idea of where something important might be. A feature that is notable for being optional, that you can switch off. Neither system is perfect, but even if you play Prime with that hint system active, I would argue that time those games let you stumble around without direction, experimenting, before triggering the hint was a good thing. That window of experimentation with the potential to get the player lost may be enough time to let them find the path forward themselves, or stumble into optional items as they reassess the game world with a recently acquired ability. This is unlikely to happen in Dread, as it cuts off your ability to backtrack and trips you into a teleporter that sends you to the right place. Boss fights are pretty great, and usually encourage proactive play. Not many bosses throw you into waiting phases. There's this one where you have to jump over some beams, and even then how frantically quick it all comes at you keeps the pace of the fight up. That's what's great about the bosses, really. It feels like you always need to be moving, and you're always being tempted to try and land hits from any angle possible, even the awkward ones, all while staying out of the way of whatever barrage is coming at you. Samus can now counter her way into extreme takedowns, similar to the ones seen in Other M, and this stuff does feel a bit jarring for me. Before Other M, it was rare for Samus to climb onto monsters and be thrown all over the place. It's cool looking, but does it suit the character? It frames her as much more animalistic, when I felt there was a charm to this human figure standing over the alien monster she just took down. Like, the cool stuff Samus did was you in the gameplay, and the cutscene was just a moment for player and Samus to let the adrenaline subside before getting back to the task at hand. One last glance back before moving on, maybe. Felt more human. Human ingenuity and perseverance won the day, and not just brute strength. There's one time in Dread where the post-boss cutscene is very restrained, but so much, it's so cold that it's almost comedic. Just cuts to Samus like, Makes it look like that was so easy for her, she's zoning out as the boss does its defeat animation. At least the game asks of you to hit shoot yourself in these sequences, which makes them feel a little more involved. But I never played Metroid for stylish QuickTime events, no matter how beastly they make Samus look. How Samus should behave as a character is pretty controversial after Other M. Her in-depth monologuing in that game was not well received, so now I think there's trepidation surrounding having her talk. Even though it's not the literal talking that people really had a problem with in Other M. In that game, she doesn't speak out loud much at all. It was her inner thoughts being blasted so constantly at the player that people had a problem with, and the thoughts themselves often stating obvious stuff, or rather unconfidently expressing certain needs and wants that felt rather incongruous with a woman stomping aliens for 10 hours.
The word he so obviously chose, outsider, pierced my heart.
Of course, Samus has talked and had inner monologues well before Other M. In Super Metroid, she does the opening narration, and in Fusion, she has internal monologue like Other M, and even a few conversations. In fact, it didn't make a whole lot of sense why in Prime 2 and 3, she didn't drop a yes or no here and there. It is worth taking into account, though, that those instances were in text. You could use your imagination to fill in how she was delivering what she was saying, rather than having a voice actor potentially undermine the tone or demeanor you'd expect Samus to have. So anyway, just because her character speaking in one game was poorly received, doesn't mean we should never have her do it again. But Dread picks the perfect middle ground for players who still have Other M PTSD, and that's to have her say her one line in the game in Chozo.
Kino ulo turuta. Ana maril sanur pura. Ay marhel kalom.
It makes sense for the scene she's in, it's to the point, but most importantly, it's badass. You get this delay after this massive lore dump about what evil is being done, and then all she has to say is, I'll sort it. Not I'll try, not understood, I will end this. The way her theme fades in as if to say she's the ominous force to be reckoned with, and not the powerful aliens orchestrating it, is really cool. I am a fan being serviced. Like most Metroid games, this confidence doesn't come from a place of physical superiority to all other predators, because Samus is rarely that outside of like the last 10 minutes of a game. It comes from a place of confidence that no matter what, she'll find a way to fix the problem, to thwart this threat to the galaxy, with cunning and ingenuity. After this moment, I was like, oh, this character is back, it's been a while. Yes, the scales have been rebalanced nicely from Other M to make Samus cool once more as a pop culture figure, by making her say something, but it's like one cool line, and the game otherwise lets how cool she is speak for itself. It works. Trying to recharacterize her again, but with different long monologues would have presented more potential pitfalls. But this is still of course backtracking far beyond Other M. As a direct follow-up to Fusion, you may wonder why we were privy to Samus's thought process so much in that game. Much less than in Other M, but still substantially. And here on the other hand, we get none of that. So there is this feeling they're playing it extra safe. And look, not everyone was a fan even in Fusion of being subjected to her thoughts on lift rides. But here, having them between areas like in Fusion wouldn't have changed anything, considering how long the game takes to load between areas anyway. We're often subjected to 30 seconds of looking at Samus on a lift anyway. Could have been a decent time to have her recap some thoughts, given how complex the story of Metroid has gotten by this point, with all the different DNAs in Samus and her relationship to all the various alien races. These loading screens feel like the most archaic part of the game. Graphics, performance, yeah, the Switch lags behind the competition in regards to that stuff, but it's in the loading where the antiquated hardware hurts the most, now that I play all my other modern games on a PC or PS5, where the SSD helps keep me in the action. Moving between big chunks of the game world is so stop and start, I have to wonder if this encouraged the devs to handhold the player as much as they did, because backtracking across the whole game world to explore and pass things out would be one hell of a drag, making repeated trips through the loading time stations. Also, it still baffles me how awful Joy-Cons are. I've played this game now on 2 different Joy-Con sets, and both times my analog stick would just send Samus off on her own. I have GameCube controllers from 20 years ago that aren't this broken. Metroid Dread isn't the longest game in the series, but that does lend it a tremendous amount of momentum. You're acquiring moves non-stop, for better or for worse, the game preventing you from getting lost, only precipitating the speed at which you crush your way through the planet ZDR. Combine that with a host of cool bosses, and you have a game that, while I don't think really improves much on its legacy, and in some ways, like in aspects of presentation and music, falls short of it, definitely feels like it deserves a place in this storied franchise. There's one aspect where I think Metroid Dread seriously drops the ball though, and it's the Dread part of the game. We're introduced to the Emmy, robot pursuers who hunt Samus down throughout the game. They can one-hit kill her and are indestructible until you acquire a temporary power-up. The title of the game and the way the mood gets all ominous when an Emmy is nearby, a tense alert theme playing when they've spotted you, and you having no choice but to run, implies the game is wishing to elicit a sense of fear from you, but this never happened. Don't get me wrong, the act of using Samus's nimble moves to outmaneuver these guys and turn the tables on them is fun and satisfying. It's just the entire way the tension is constructed falls flat. First of all, the Emmy only appear in specific, designated regions of the map, so you know exactly when to expect them. This is in contrast to something like the SAX in Fusion, which appears only a few times, but was a total surprise when it did. The other aspect that undermines things is how the game has liberal checkpoints instead of save stations doubling as checkpoints. If you die in an Emmy zone, you'll revive right outside seconds ago, and with just how little punishment there is for being caught, I wasn't afraid of them. It's safe to say I felt far more tension in previous Metroid games with harsher save systems than at any point in an Emmy zone. If you get grabbed by one, you get 2 chances to counter them and escape. You have to hit the button within a tight window to let Samus get free, and it is tough, but not impossible. I ended up getting it down quite well, and the issue is, once you do, the whole scenario gets completely defanged, because you can essentially just start running into Emmy zones carelessly, get grabbed by an Emmy, hit the quick time correctly, escape, and just reload seconds earlier if you miss the counter. Now, I'm not suggesting save points should double as checkpoints in the game as it is. Scenarios like the one Emmy who can catch you underwater would no doubt become frustrating, but the way the title operates right now is not conducive to a dread feeling. The game isn't prepared to create pursuers or levels that are horrifying, really, on an aesthetic level either, which would help offset the mechanics not being conducive to making the situation scary. I can think of enemies and environments from previous Metroid games far more unnerving simply based on how they look, compared to the Emmy and their layers. You're in grey corridors with the contrast up being chased by an expensive coffee machine. Maybe if all you play is Switch, and you're used to just Mario and Pokemon, then this is gonna have you shaking and quaking, but it didn't do much for me. Overall, I'd say ZDR's visual design lacks a certain something. There certainly are some striking areas. It doesn't feel entirely generic as a space. I love this one room with the red and blue contrasting in the background. At the end of the day though, it still feels like we're just going down the checklist of fire, water, plant, ancient rock temple, which this franchise has done plenty of by now. I'm just done with environment biomes in Metroid games. I get that there's a pull to include some diversity, but for such a short title, and especially for something like Metroid, it would be fine to just hone in the focus to just a few types of areas, or just one that it can explore to the fullest. I don't want a Metroid game that's just fire or just plants, but a spooky research facility or abandoned colony offers ample opportunity for diversity, without needing to force in every color of the rainbow. Point is, does a game called Metroid Dread need a jungle tack in the power of the Juju level where you jump on big flowers? I don't think it does. I think the Prime sequels were really good at creating new and interesting alien places that defied typical categorization, and even when they did focus on a kind of single elemental theme, managed to make them feel unique. Another thing I prefer about the worlds in Prime is how they don't use standardized rooms. By which I mean in those games, every map or save room was a unique space that made the game world feel more natural and real. These more recent Metroids are still happy to replicate the format from 20 years ago, where every save room was basically just the same room, copy-pasted across the whole game. It's still also surprising to me how Metroid doesn't invest in more optional bosses for the myriad optional power-ups to be used on. Speaking of of which, it's awesome to get more creative little movement challenges to unlock these upgrades. Chaining together shine sparks is always satisfying, finesse and good timing being rewarded with tremendous speed, and when there's an item at the end of it, even better. I could go for a whole DLC challenge pack of these types of challenges, but it is undoubtedly fun to stumble upon them in the game world and piece together what parts of the game space are needed to acquire your next goodie. 100% item collection is made more of a practical goal here than in a lot of Metroids, with a pretty long and tough final boss that is no pushover even when maxed out, though it's still one that feels well designed enough to be beatable without loads of upgrades if you're aiming to blast through the game as quick as possible. In many ways, it's a perfect balance. If you're really skilled at the combat, you can beat it without a load of upgrades, but if you're not too great at the combat, you can get an edge by going back and exploring the game world more thoroughly, proving yourself in a few puzzle-like movement challenges. If we're going to talk about this final boss fight in further detail, we're going to have to finally talk about the story properly. So spoilers, I guess. It's been so long since we've gotten a Metroid game that actually gets to move the story forward beyond the edge of the timeline. So much time that it almost gives Dread a kind of uncanny feel. After eradicating the X-Parasite in Metroid Fusion, Samus is lured to planet ZDR by footage of surviving parasites there. Upon arrival, a Chozo warrior owns her, and she sets about trying to put the pieces together about what is going on. This duda, Ravenbeak, wants to bring back the Metroids to create an ultimate army, and has taken control of the Emmy to extract Metroid DNA from Samus to create more. She was injected with it at the start of Fusion to make her immune to X-Parasites, which are creatures Metroids prey on. Halfway into the game, Samus discovers that there are in fact X-Parasites on ZDR. Ravenbeak orchestrates their release, and they start to consume enemies all over the game. It's a cool surprise halfway in that these enemies from Fusion have made a return, but also that the game is willing to let a different enemy variant overrun the game world halfway in, shifting the dynamic of play a little. On the subject of returning enemies, thank God Ridley does not show up in this game. They showed some restraint, realized he does not need to be contrived in for the sake of it in every game, diluting his rivalry with Samus down into routine. Instead, the throwback boss this time is Kraid, who is just here with no explanation. I'm glad they opted for him to be the fan service boss this time. It has been a while since he was last in a Metroid game. But he's on thin ice now. I'd say this is the last time we can reuse him before he too becomes played out. As Samus goes through the game, her Metroid DNA starts to consume her body more and more, giving her more Metroid powers beyond her ability to absorb X that she got in Fusion. Now she's grabbing enemies and sucking out their life force, Metroid style, and as cool of a development as that is, it's a shame it doesn't become a move you can perform in gameplay, only showing up in cutscenes. Ravenbeak decides by this point that rather than extracting the Metroid DNA from Samus, he'd rather just straight up clone her, now that the DNA has all but made her a powerful Metroid. Cloning has really become the trump card for elongating any threat in this franchise. Did a major character or creature die? Well, just scrape 5 strands of DNA off the ground and we can keep this going. Either way, having Samus become biologically a Metroid is pretty cool. Metroid in the Chozo's language means Ultimate Warrior, and prior to Dread, I saw this as a cute way to make the title of the games be relevant, even if the Metroid creature itself didn't make an appearance. The name of this franchise referred to you just as much as those floating jellyfish, because by the end of the game, it's you, Samus, who is the Ultimate Warrior. Dread takes this to a whole new literal level, though, by just turning Samus into a Metroid, retroactively, officially making her the eponymous hero of this series. Can you retroactively make something eponymous? Does that even make any sense to say? I think it's pretty cool and rewarding for longtime players to essentially officially bestow upon them the title of Metroid, to twist things and make it so that this whole 30-year-old franchise was leading up to this moment. It wasn't a franchise about killer jellyfish. The name of the franchise refers to you just as much as those floating jellyfish and the various forms they take, because by the end of the game it's you, Samus, who is the Ultimate Warrior. It wasn't a franchise about a monster or creature you fight, but about this legendary character who would one day become Metroid. But do I need Samus screaming her head off as she achieves Super Saiyan Metroid level 3? I don't know about that. I find her calmly affirming she'll beat the game way cooler than her screaming her way to superiority over the final boss. I get that it's supposed to underline the severity of this moment. She's never shouted like this before, but she's also been in so many life or death scenarios up to this point that it feels a little arbitrary. I guess I'm concerned we've maybe slingshotted a little hard from Other M, where she would get nervous, to now her acting way too overzealously defiant. It's still emotional, just on the other side of the spectrum. I don't want Samus to win by winning an arm wrestle in a cutscene. I want to do it myself in gameplay. She's usually a character whose quiet demeanor lends itself to inserting yourself into her role, and it seems pointless to undermine that for a type of scene we get in countless other games. A dime a dozen screaming victory willpower moment. Either way, fighting a flesh and blood Chozo is a novel and cool final boss that gives us something different while still feeling relevant and personal. This guy is the Chozo's most powerful warrior with swag to spare. He turns out to have been the provider of the dominant Chozo DNA Samus was given as a child, the major source of Samus's superhuman physique and ability. So essentially we have the fight between the Chozo's two ultimate warriors, their two Metroids so to speak, to end this series up to this point. There's of course room here to pick holes in the plot. At one point, a friendly Chozo's body gets possessed by an X that tries to then sabotage Samus. But at the end, that same X-possessed Chozo helps Samus out. I guess we just have to assume that off-screen, that Chozo overcame its parasite in its own screaming willpower moment, even if the climax presents a fair novelty. And Metroid Dread is overall good and occasionally pretty great for what it is. It doesn't feel fresh enough on the whole to make up for the last 2 decades of no original 2D Metroids, or the last decade of no original mainline Metroids. The reality is that we still feel like we're in Tribute Act territory, capitalizing on that absence. Power-ups, bosses, environments, it feels like the perfect Metroid game to have released, I don't know, on the Wii or Wii U in 2012, or I don't know, on the DS in 2007 or something, as was the original plan when the series was riding high. All we really get by doing this a whole 14 years later, and not on the original DS, is that we get to zoom in all 3D into epic moments, and we probably came away with some disadvantages doing it now instead. If this had been made for original DS hardware, it probably wouldn't have had to load as much. And yet, despite the shoddy hardware and minimal innovation, Dread is probably one of the games I've played most on the Switch so far in its lifespan. Just a solid pick-up-and-play title that is fast-paced and satisfying moment to moment. Sure, Dread isn't very fresh for the series, but I guess you could say it's fresh to get a quality Metroid game at all anymore, with cool moments dotted in, that deserve to be canonized alongside the best events of the franchise. Metroid is back. This isn't the game to make it king again, but that doesn't mean it's not a satisfying arena to test your might in, as the ultimate warrior.